Well, hello and welcome to a special episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders podcast. The reason this is a special episode is because today we are bringing you a conversation that was hosted as part of our recent online event called Stirrings. And the reason we thought it was important to bring this conversation into our podcast this week was because as we look across the landscape of the Australian church and the great opportunities and hunger and desire to plant many more multiplying churches in our nation, one of the great challenges that we keep hearing and we recognize in our country is around the leadership pipeline. Where are the leaders coming from? How are we going to raise up more church planters in order to reach new people with the gospel of Jesus? And so we wanted to bring this conversation into the podcast environment to be able to welcome people in on this conversation. We hosted Mac Lake as part of our event Stirrings, and Mac is a leadership consultant who has worked particularly within the US church and within Exponential in the US. And Mac brought us a fascinating conversation around what it means for churches and church leaders in particular to think about the leaders that we are raising up, particularly to plant the churches that we know that God wants us to plant in our nation. And so we hope that this conversation blesses you this week. We just wanted to quickly as well bring to your attention some really exciting things that we're excited to let the Australian church know about what Exponential has got coming up. Firstly, just this week at the time of this podcast being released, we have our first gathering of the Church Planters Collective. The Church Planters Collective is a space where anyone who either has planted a church in the last 5 years or is intending to in the next 2 can gather together with planters from right across our country, irrespective of tribe or style of church that they are planting, to be encouraged and to share some of the unique challenges that church planting brings. We would love you to consider joining us this week on Thursday. It is not too late to join. Jump online and look at the Church Planters Collective, and all that might encourage you in the leading and the pioneering of the church that God has led you to plant. And secondly, we've got some very exciting events that we are beginning to announce and roll out as we head towards 2023. Firstly, with our regional events in March in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, as well as our inaugural Exponential Australia conference on the 17th and 18th of October on the Gold Coast. We would love to have you join us for those events. So would you now listen on as we hear from Mac Lake in this special edition of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders podcast, talking about raising, identifying, and equipping leaders. Well, Mac, we are so glad that you could be with us today as part of our Stirrings event. Hey, we're going to jump straight in the deep end, particularly pertaining to this question of the leadership pipeline and how can churches, denominations, senior church leaders be considering how do they develop a pipeline in order to solve their leadership shortage. And I guess the first question is the really obvious one. When it comes to a pipeline, where does that, I guess, initial problem spawn from? Like if we use that analogy of the river upstream, where is that problem coming from?
Oh, man. Yes. Great question and great analogy. I'm 61 years old and I can look back and go, okay, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it seems like there was just this natural flow of leaders in the church and people eager to lead in the church, and the seminaries were full and, life was good, churches being planted. Well, then over the past few years, it's like that stream has come down to a trickle. And I think as I travel around and I work with so many churches, one of the big problems I see is that many pastors, staff members, and key lay leaders in the church, I think they see themselves as doers rather than developers. And we've gotten so busy doing the work of the ministry, making the ministry machine work Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, that all of a sudden the development, church has become an event. Discipleship has become an event. And we've moved away from this relational aspect, and now it's slowed down to this trickle. And I think that's why we have the problem. I remember when I planted our church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, a few years into it, we were seeing a lot of people saved. And a few years into it, I remember standing in the pulpit saying, we've got a leadership problem, guys. We got a leadership problem. We need more leaders. And I woke up one day and realized I was wrong. We did not have a leadership problem. We had a leadership development problem. The leaders were there. There were entrepreneurs in our church. There were coaches. There were supervisors, managers, principals of schools, moms running households. There were leaders there. We needed to teach them how to live a biblical lifestyle of leadership. That's what was missing. And so leadership wasn't the problem. It was leadership development was the problem. And so one of the things that I do today as I travel around and the book, The Multiplication Effect, helps churches build an intentional pathway to develop leaders. It's known as the leadership pipeline, but you see it over my shoulder here. And so I think one of the things we've gotten away from is that intentional discipling people through an intentional pathway. So one of the things I think churches have to establish is, what is our leadership pipeline? And for those who aren't familiar with it, real quick, it's, down at the bottom, the largest pool of people in your church are those who lead themselves. And so I got to look in who's attending my church, who's getting involved, who's serving. And from that pool of people, they will move up and become, to that first level, a leader of others, a leader of a team or a leader of a group. And then it's from those leaders, you need them to go to another step, not all of them, some of them. And that's the leader of leaders. And this is one of the biggest missing pieces in so many churches today, challenging a lay leader to say, hey, we want you not just to lead a group or not just lead a team. We want you to lead some leaders.
Wow.
And challenge them to do that. And now they're getting greater leadership experience. You're broadening their spiritual responsibility, their spiritual leadership responsibility. Sometimes people put people at this level, but they make it about administration versus spiritual leadership. And then from that level, you move somebody up to lead a department. Now they're leading a ministry area. This could be paid or unpaid, but now they're leading you're empowering them to lead that entire student ministry, groups ministry, whatever it is. And from there, now they can lead the organization, to lead the church. And so it's a natural progression pathway. And the key to this intentional pathway is you can't skip levels. There are certain competencies you have to learn along the way. So you don't want to skip levels. So, where's the problem spawn from? It spawns because a lot of people at the top of the pipeline are doers, and they don't have an intentional pathway to develop people in the spiritual leadership competencies they need in order to lead at higher levels. And so years ago, I built a church plant assessment, and we built this into the assessment. So when couples would come in, we would assess, what levels have you led at in the past? And there were so many who would come through. We go, okay, you've only led at this level. You need to get more experience at this level next before you go start a church. Wow. So I think one of the things I would say to the audience here today is, develop begin to have a developer mindset, but also you got to have that intentional pathway of where you're going to develop people to. Otherwise, you're doing generic leadership development, not intentionally moving somebody through an intentional pathway.
That's phenomenal, Mac. I've often heard it said that discipleship and leadership are inseparable from one another. I guess my question for us as church leaders today who would be listening is, how can we be more purposeful about obviously making disciples, deepening disciples, and also then with that giving opportunity for the reproduction and subsequent opportunities for leadership that may lead to things like, leadership of departments and as we're going to talk about soon, that will hopefully then lead to church planting.
Yeah. I like to tell the churches I'm working with, I'm trying to get people to adopt a new, ancient approach to leadership development. And so let me show you what I mean, because it's so funny when I'm working with churches, I will literally have staff members look at me and go, you don't understand. we're too busy to develop leaders. And so this is where I'm going to screen share and share this chart. We've got to go back and look at Jesus' behaviors. What did Jesus do? So look at this really quickly. I put this together a couple of years ago to help people understand not just what Jesus did, but when he did it. So really quickly, in 26 AD, in fall of 26 AD, right here, this is where Jesus came on the scene, his public ministry. He was baptized, had his temptation, and people began to go, okay, who is this guy? He even met some of what would be his apostles. He met some of them in this phase. But what I want you to notice is it was 1 year later, it was the next fall, where he looked at Peter, James, Andrew, and John and said, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. Now, this was not an invitation into leadership, it was an invitation into followership. It was an invitation into discipleship. So it was 1 year. Now, he had met these guys. He met them over here, did not invite them into discipleship for a full year. Now, look at this block, summer of 28 AD. I put that in red because it's at that point, it is the midpoint. You're over here, 30 AD, spring of 30 AD is his death and resurrection. But right here, summer of 28 AD, Jesus goes up on a mountain. Luke in Luke 6 tells us Jesus goes on a mountain, he prays all night, comes down to the bottom of the mountain, and Luke tells us he calls his disciples to himself. How many? We don't know. But it was more than 12, because Luke goes on to say, and from among them, he chose 12.
Wow.
So imagine 100 people at the base of that mountain, and Jesus going, you, 11, 12, you 12 come with me. Everybody else, you are dismissed. You can go home. You 12, you're going to be my leaders, and I'm going to start doing leadership development with you.
Wow.
Now, what happened after here, and I won't go into it, we don't have the time, but if you study what happened after this point for the next year, it's unbelievable the intensity of discipleship Jesus is doing with these 12 men, challenging them, stretching them, giving them assignments, modeling for them, debriefing with them, processing with them, stretching their faith, stretching their leadership competencies, asking them hard questions, making hard statements. Hey, if you're going to follow me, you better take up your cross and follow me. It's unbelievable the depth of discipleship that's happening, because it went from basic discipleship from that summer to intense discipleship as leadership development.
That's incredible, Mark. At Exponential, obviously, and you have a strong connection with Exponential in the US, but our strong passion and desire is church planting, of which leadership is obviously intricately connected. As you and I were talking off air before, it feels like in Australia, and I'm sure other parts of the world as well, there is no shortage of vision or even money or buildings when it comes to this passion to want to plant churches. Yet it feels like one of the great challenges that at least I would attest to here in Australia is when it comes to leadership development. And I guess my question for us today, particularly for church leaders who are here wanting to plant churches, they're passionate about the cause of Christ and advancing the kingdom. How can I guess we start? And again, it's been a very short time that we've had together today, but how can we go back up that water source to better, remedy some of those problems that we talked about before, that we are hoping and praying and wanting to be proactive about, actually leading to many more churches being planted in our nation?
Yeah. First, we have to have the intentional pathway and recognize the importance of each level of that pathway and the competencies needed that pathway. But second, we need an intentional apprenticing process, discipleship, mentoring process with leaders. There's some people ask me sometimes, what's the difference between discipleship and leadership development? And I say, hey, they're really one and the same. They're one and the same. But with discipleship, you're teaching somebody to have intimacy with Jesus. In leadership development, you're teaching somebody to have influence for Jesus. In discipleship, you're teaching somebody to lead themselves. In leadership development, you're teaching them to lead others. In discipleship, you're teaching them to live like Jesus. In leadership development, you're teaching them to lead like Jesus. And so we've got to begin to teach people to lead like Jesus so they can lead a church and plant a church and lead a church. And it is this intentional relational apprenticing process that we've got to get back to. I had a denomination call me. This was several years ago because I've been very involved with church planting. And they said, hey, Mac, we want to plant a church in, I'll make up a city, Chicago. And I said, okay, well, hey, don't you have churches in Chicago? And they said, yeah, we do. We do. I said, well, don't any of them have anybody that they said, no, not really. And I'm going, oh my gosh, here's what's happened. In the States, there's a strong interest in church planting again. I'm thankful for that. But what a lot of people are doing, they're trying to find church planters rather than develop church planters. And so what I'm saying is we don't have a church planting problem. We don't. We've got a discipleship problem. The root of the problem is discipleship. The fruit of the problem is a lack of church planters. And if we would get back to just discipling leaders, but what we do is we find somebody, they come to Christ, they begin to grow, they begin to live like Jesus, and we go, yes, that's great. Then we pick them up and we throw them into the swimming pool of leadership and hope they learn to lead, and they fail and they struggle. And so many people, this is part of why we have a shortage, so many people go, I led in the church and I nearly drowned in that swimming pool and I'm never getting near it again.
Wow.
I had so many churches say, oh man, we got a recruitment problem, especially after COVID. We got a recruitment problem. And when I dig in, they don't have a recruitment problem. They got a retention problem. A lack of leadership development not only leads to a lack of character in our leaders and a lack of competency in our leaders, it also leads to a lack of confidence in our leaders. So they step out of leadership, they abort leadership early, and they never make it up the pathway because of a failure to disciple and develop them in the character and the competencies and the confidence needed to move up a pathway to go, God has called me to go do this.
Wow.
And I know God's called me to do it because you poured into me and you believed me and you equipped me to go do this. And that's why I put this series together. It's the Discipling Leaders series, because I'm creating content for every level of the pipeline to teach the leaders the character and competencies they need to lead at every level, so we can begin to disciple people through the leadership pathway or leadership pipeline, so that we can have more staff members, more upper level leaders, and more church planters as a result.
Mac, that's incredible. Where could some of our listeners today go to find some of those resources?
Yeah, you can go to Amazon.com. I have them on my website as well, but the shipping expense would be big. So you can go to Amazon.com, and they have those are available in Australia through Amazon as well.
Incredible, Mac. Well, hey, we so appreciate your time today. We know it's just been a taste, and we so look forward to connecting with you in the future and seeing the many opportunities that are already here in Australia to develop leaders that would then go on to plant churches that would reach new people in our nation.
There's one final thing I'll say, one final challenge. I challenge everybody, think slower, not faster. Think smaller, not bigger. Find you 2 to 3 people that you can begin to disciple as leaders. Intentionally move them through that pathway. And watch what happens over a few years. We got to think slower, not faster. Got to think smaller, not bigger.
Incredible, Mac. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.